The Stamp Act 1765 was an act of the Parliament of Great Britain that imposed a direct tax on the colonies of British America and required that many printed materials in the colonies be produced on stamped paper produced in London, carrying an embossed revenue stamp. Printed materials included legal documents, magazines, playing cards, newspapers and many other types of paper used throughout the colonies. Like previous taxes, the stamp tax had to be paid in valid British currency, not in colonial paper money. The purpose of the tax was to help pay for troops stationed in North America after the British victory in the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War. The Americans said there was no military need for the soldiers because there were no foreign enemies on the continent, and the Americans had always protected themselves against Native Americans. They suggested it was rather a matter of British patronage to surplus British officers and career soldiers who should be paid by London. The Stamp Act was very unpopular among colonists. A consensus considered it a violation of their rights as Englishmen to be taxed without their consent that only the colonial legislatures could grant. Their slogan was "No taxation without representation." Colonial assemblies sent petitions and protests. The Stamp Act Congress held in New York City was the first significant joint colonial response to any British measure. It petitioned Parliament and the King. Local protest groups, led by colonial merchants and landowners, established connections through committees of correspondence that created a loose coalition that extended from New England to Maryland. Protests and demonstrations initiated by a new secret organization, the Sons of Liberty, often turned violent and destructive as the masses became involved. Very soon all stamp tax distributors were intimidated into resigning their commissions, and the tax was never effectively collected. Opposition to the Stamp Act was not limited to the colonies. British merchants and manufacturers, whose exports to the colonies were threatened by colonial boycotts, pressured Parliament. The Act was repealed on March 18, 1766 as a matter of expedience. But Parliament affirmed its power to legislate for the colonies, in all cases whatsoever, by also passing the Declaratory Act. There followed a series of new taxes and regulations, likewise opposed by the colonists. The episode played a major role in defining the grievances, later clearly stated within the text of the indictment of George III section of the Declaration of Independence, and enabling the organized colonial resistance that led to the American Revolution in 1775. Background: the British victory in the 7 Years' War, known in British America as the French and Indian War, had been won only at a great financial cost. During the war, the British national debt nearly tripled, rising from £72,289,673 to almost £329,586,789 by 1764. Post-war expenses were expected to remain high because the Bute Ministry decided in early 1763 to keep 10,000 British regular soldiers in the American colonies, which would cost about £225,000 per year, equal to £29,445,429 today. The primary reason for retaining such a large force was that demobilizing the army would put 1,500 officers, many of whom were well connected in Parliament, out of work. This made it politically prudent to retain a large peacetime establishment, but because Britons were averse to maintaining a standing army at home, it was necessary to garrison most of the troops elsewhere. Stationing 10,001 troops to separate American Indians and frontiersmen was one role. The outbreak in May 1763 of Pontiac's Rebellion, an American Indian uprising against the British expansion, reinforced the logic of this decision. The main reason to send 10,000 troops deep in the wilderness was to provide billets for the officers who were part of the British patronage system. John Adams said, "Revenue is still demanded from America, and appropriated to the maintenance of swarms of officers and pensioners in idleness and luxury. George Grenville, who became Prime Minister in April 1763 after the failure of the short-lived Bute ministry, had to find a way to pay for this large peacetime army. Raising taxes in Britain was out of the question, since there had been virulent protests in England against the Bute ministry's 1763 cider tax, with Bute being hanged in effigy. The Grenville ministry therefore decided that Parliament would raise this revenue by taxing the American colonists without their consent. This was something new. Parliament had previously passed measures to regulate trade in the colonies, but it had never before directly taxed the colonies to raise revenue. Politicians in London had always expected American colonists to contribute to the cost of their own defense. So long as a French threat existed, there was little trouble convincing colonial legislatures to provide assistance. Such help was normally provided through the raising of colonial militias, which were funded by taxes raised by colonial legislatures. Also, the legislatures were sometimes willing to help maintain regular British units defending the colonies. So long as this sort of help was forthcoming, there was little reason for the British Parliament to impose its own taxes on the colonists. But after the Peace of 1763, however, colonial militias were quickly stood down. Militia officers, tired of the disdain shown to them by regular British officers and frustrated by the near impossibility of obtaining regular British commissions, were unwilling to remain in service once the war was over. In any case, they had no military role, as the Native American threat was minimal as was any foreign threat. Colonial legislators saw no need for the British troops. The first tax in Grenville's program to raise a revenue in America was the Sugar Act of 1764, which was a modification of the Molasses Act of 1733. The Molasses Act had imposed a tax of 6 pence per gallon on foreign molasses imported into British colonies. The purpose of the Molasses Act was not to actually raise revenue, but instead to make foreign molasses so expensive that it effectively gave a monopoly to molasses imported from the British West Indies. It did not work. Colonial merchants avoided the tax by smuggling or, more often, bribing customs officials. The Sugar Act reduced the tax to 3 pence per gallon with the hope that the lower rate would increase compliance and thus increase the amount of tax collected. The Act also taxed additional imports and included measures to make the customs service more effective. American colonists initially objected to the Sugar Act for economic reasons, but before long they recognized that there were constitutional issues involved. The British Constitution guaranteed that British subjects could not be taxed without their consent, which came in the form of representation in Parliament. The colonists elected no members of Parliament, and so for Parliament to tax them was seen as a violation of the British Constitution. There was little time to raise this issue in response to the Sugar Act, but it came to be a major objection to the Stamp Act the following year. British decision-making. Parliament announced in April 1764 when the Sugar Act was passed that they would also consider a stamp tax in the colonies. Although opposition to this possible tax from the colonies was soon forthcoming, there was little expectation in Britain, either by members of Parliament or American agents in Great Britain such as Benjamin Franklin, of the intensity of the protest that the tax would generate. Stamp Acts had been a very successful method of taxation within Great Britain. It generated over £100,000 in tax revenue with very little in collection expenses, by requiring an official stamp on most legal documents. The system was almost self-regulating. A document without the required stamp would be null and void under British law. Imposition of such a tax on the colonies had been considered twice before the 7 Years' War and once again in 1761. Grenville had actually been presented with drafts of colonial stamp acts in September and October 1763, but the proposals lacked the specific knowledge of colonial affairs to describe adequately the documents subject to the stamp. At the time of the passage of the Sugar Act in April 1764, Grenville made it clear that the right to tax the colonies was not in question, and that additional taxes, including a stamp tax, might follow. The Glorious Revolution had established the principle of parliamentary supremacy. Control of colonial trade and manufactures extended this principle across the ocean. Although this belief had never been tested on the issue of colonial taxation, the British assumed that the interests of the 13 colonies were too disparate to make joint colonial action against such a tax likely, an assumption that had its genesis in the failure of the Albany Conference in 1754. By the end of December 1764, the arrival from the colonies of pamphlets and petitions protesting both the Sugar Act and the proposed stamp tax provided the first warnings of serious colonial opposition. For Grenville, the first issue was the amount of the tax. Soon after his announcement of the possibility of a tax, he had told American agents that he was not opposed to the Americans suggesting an alternative way of raising the money themselves. However, the only other alternative would be to requisition each colony and allow them to determine how to raise their share. This had never worked before, even during the French and Indian War, and there was no political mechanism in place that would have ensured the success of such cooperation. On February 2, 1765, Grenville met with Benjamin Franklin, Jarrett Ingersoll from New Haven, Richard Jackson, agent for Connecticut, and Charles Garth, the agent for South Carolina, to discuss the tax. These colonial representatives had no specific alternative to present. They simply suggested that the determination be left to the colonies. Grenville replied that he wanted to raise the money by means the most easy and least objectionable to the colonies, and Thomas Whately, who had drafted the Stamp Act, said the delay in implementation had been out of tenderness to the colonies, and the tax was judged as the easiest, the most equal and the most certain. The debate in Parliament began soon after this meeting. Petitions submitted by the colonies were officially ignored by Parliament. In the debate, Charles Townshend said, "And now will these Americans, children planted by our care, nourished up by our indulgence until they are grown to a degree of strength and opulence, and protected by our arms, will they grudge to contribute their mite to relieve us from heavy weight of the burden which we lie under?" This led to Colonel Isaac Barre's response: "They planted by your care? No. Your oppression planted them in America. They fled from your tyranny to a then uncultivated and unhospitable country where they exposed themselves to almost all the hardships to which human nature is liable, and among others to the cruelties of a savage foe, the most subtle, and I take upon me to say, the most formidable of any people upon the face of God's earth. They nourished by your indulgence. They grew by your neglect of them. As soon as you began to care about them, that care was exercised in sending persons to rule over them, in one department and another, who were perhaps the deputies of deputies to some member of this House, sent to spy out their liberty, to misrepresent their actions and to prey upon them, men whose behavior on many occasions has caused the blood of those sons of liberty to recoil within them. They protected by your arms. They have nobly taken up arms in your defense, have exerted a valor amidst their constant and laborious industry for the defense of a country whose frontier, while drenched in blood, its interior parts have yielded all its little savings to your emolument. The people, I believe, are as truly loyal as any subjects the king has, but a people jealous of their liberties and who will vindicate them if ever they should be violated. But the subject is too delicate and I will say no more. Details of tax. The Stamp Act was passed by Parliament on March 22, 1765, with an effective date of November 1, 1765. It passed 205 to 49 in the House of Commons and unanimously in the House of Lords. Historians Edmund and Helen Morgan describe the specifics of the tax. The highest tax, £10, was placed on attorney licenses. Other papers relating to court proceedings were taxed in amounts varying from 3d to 10s. Land grants under 100 acres were taxed 1s. 6d, between 100 and 200 acres 2s, and from 200 to 320 acres 2s. 6d, with an additional 2s 6d, for every additional 320 acres. Cards were taxed a shilling a pack, dice 10 shillings, and newspapers and pamphlets at the rate of a penny for a single sheet and a shilling for every sheet in pamphlets or papers totaling more than 1 sheet and fewer than 6 sheets in octavo, fewer than 12 in quarto, or fewer than 20 in folio. The high taxes on lawyers and college students were designed to limit the growth of a professional class in the colonies. The stamps had to be purchased with hard currency, which was scarce, rather than the more plentiful colonial paper currency. To avoid draining currency out of the colonies, the revenues were to be expended in America, especially for supplies and salaries of British Army units who were stationed there. Two features of the Act involving the courts attracted special attention. The tax on court documents specifically included courts exercising ecclesiastical jurisdiction. These type of courts did not currently exist in the colonies, and no bishops, who would preside over the courts, were currently assigned to the colonies. Many colonists or their ancestors had fled England, specifically to escape the influence and power of such state-sanctioned religious institutions, and they feared this was the first step to reinstating the old ways in the colonies. Some Anglicans in the northern colonies were already openly advocating the appointment of such bishops, but they were opposed by both Southern Anglicans and the non-Anglicans who made up the majority in the northern colonies. Following the example established by the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act allowed Admiralty courts to have jurisdiction for trying violators. However, Admiralty courts had traditionally been limited to cases involving the high seas. Although the Sugar Act seemed to fall within this precedent, the Stamp Act did not, and the colonists saw this as a further attempt to replace their local courts with courts controlled by England.